Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing, as well as analysing, tech news, which as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. We have an awful lot of stuff to get through in today's video. I want to begin, though, with AMD Navi 21, aka the highest end SKU in the RX 6000 series, as there has been a dual leak from both Rogame and Kamachi, who has revealed that the next generation of GPU is almost certainly going to top out at 80 compute units. This had been rumoured for some time. Indeed, a couple of my sources had told me that they believe that 80 is actually the intended number of compute units which AMD were aiming for with RDNA 2. However, this almost confirms it. Rogame, on his personal Twitter, has placed a rather interesting comparison graph which shows the differences between shader engines, the number of WGPs, workgroup processors, and so on and so on. And as you can clearly see, Navi 21, which is once again the largest SKU and will be the flagship model cards in the next generation of gaming GPUs from AMD, does indeed sport 80 compute units. So if you do basic maths, that essentially means it has double the number of compute units compared to the RX 5700 XT. But there are two other very important factors here. The first is that the clock frequencies for the next generation of GPUs is almost certainly going to be higher. There are several things which support this. The first is the console frequencies. Both the Xbox Series X and PlayStation 5 have pretty high clock frequencies compared to the 5700 XT. Now granted, if you take the PS5, yes, it only has 36 compute units, but you need to take into consideration that they are topping out at 2230 megahertz, and it's also part of an APU, and this APU is certainly not going to be gobbling down 300 plus watts because of obviously other components on the system as well. This is a very good indicator to me that the clock frequencies of the next generation cards from AMD is also going to be markedly improved compared to the first generation. Another thing is, quite a while ago now, I released an exclusive that AMD's optimization team, Silicon optimization team, had been starting to really, well, pay off. The dividends have been paying off with this optimization team. So just as a quick refresher, if you missed that video, basically with the Zen line of processors, there were folks that were basically tweaking the silicon itself to optimize it for power efficiency. And some of those folks had been pulled into the GPU division of AMD. And this stuff is not glamorous work. It can be kind of tedious. And I don't mean that as in like it's a boring job, but it can be very labor intensive. It's not something you can necessarily automate as well. And this is very imperative because not only when you're power optimizing do you, well, not use as much power, but in turn, it also means that clock frequencies can start ramping up most likely because heat is not so much of an issue. So, in my opinion anyway, there's a very good chance that the boost frequencies of these GPUs will be much higher than what we see with the comparative, I wouldn't say modest clocks of the first generation, but they're not perhaps as high as perhaps some people would have hoped. Another reason that I believe that this is going to be performing rather well is because of improvements to IPC. I was told that the next generation of AMD GPUs definitely has improvements in IPC, and AMD themselves after this has confirmed that very notion. Naturally, when it comes to IPC, it's very difficult to give definitive numbers, especially in the world of graphics. After all, what load are you kind of putting through the GPU? Is it more compute orientated? Are you putting tons of geometry work through the GPU? And so on and so on. So it's more difficult to get an accurate number of how much IPC is going to jump from one generation to the next. But personally, I'm expecting a fairly tangible bump in performance, particularly when you take other technology into the fray as well, like improvements in color compression, plus other little things which are going to be helping workloads which are more optimized for it, such as variable rate shading. Rather interestingly too, Rogame in a separate tweet seemed to insinuate, at least according to his digging thus far, that Navi 21 features a 384-bit bus with 12GB of RAM. Honestly, 12GB for a next generation card is probably going to be sufficient for a higher end GPU. Yes, I do understand that the consoles do have the benefit of an SSD being standard and all of this stuff, but honestly, I think with smart memory management and better data compression with the next-gen GPUs, we should be good to go. As I've said 1,000 times now, it's going to be fascinating to see how PCs really handle this kind of stuff. I mean, DDR4 memory is still putting out more bandwidth than a PS5 SSD anyway. So my personal gut feeling is maybe in a couple of years, the amount of system RAM you're going to need for PC gaming and higher quality settings is going to be like 32GB. Then again, it's also kind of interesting because titles like The Medium, they don't really push the boat out necessarily in what you would expect from specs for a game which looks like it does. Then again, other titles like Microsoft Flight Simulator are already suggesting that you have a decent SSD as standard and 32GB of RAM, assuming you want to really crank the settings up. But then again, I mean, look at Microsoft Flight Simulator. It just looks amazing. I think the next generation of AMD cards is definitely going to be an absolutely monstrous lineup. And I'm hearing some theories of these cards not being much faster than the 2080 Ti, which I think is absolutely ludicrous. I don't understand how people can only think it's going to be like around that ballpark, because you're looking at double the number of compute units. So even if AMD literally just say lols and just times everything by 2, it's still going to massively outperform an RX 5700 and also a 2080 Ti. It's just going to, unless they have really screwed up the GPU terribly by absolutely awful scheduling, terrible memory bandwidth constraints and so on. But assuming they're even reasonably competent and their drivers are not absolutely gargantuanly terrible, they should easily be able to beat the 2080 Ti. And the Open VR benchmark also demonstrates this. It was absolutely destroying the 2080 Ti. It was like 30% faster. And it's imperative to remember that that is early engineering samples. Of course, it's possible that that benchmark wasn't really AMD silicon, or it was fake or whatever. But personally, I am inclined to believe that that was a legitimate early engineering sample for RDNA 2. And what's quite interesting is I actually got hints that AMD have been leaking some stuff purposefully. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but a pretty good source of mine, when I mentioned about the OpenVR benchmark and I asked, do they believe it's real? And I said, someone at AMD probably got into some trouble for that. They said, yeah, well, it was an accidentally on purpose leak. So who knows? Leaks can be deliberate if they feel that they need some hype or PR, and obviously Nvidia had been really stealing a lot of hype at that point for the GPUs, so maybe. Either way, personally I think that even a modest clock frequency bump, a modest IPC gain, and doubling the number of compute units along with next generation technology, I think AMD are going to be in a pretty good spot. Is that going to be enough to beat Ampere? I honestly don't know. Assuming it becomes kind of a tit for tat with different SKUs, so for example, the 3090 might be a little bit faster than, let's just say, than the 6900, and the 6800 XT might be a little faster than, let's say, the 3080. You get the point. It's really going to come down to pricing and features, and I think honestly that is going to be amazing for us as customers. And to me, one of the biggest features that Nvidia has is DLSS technology. and also how well both of these GPUs handle hardware-based ray tracing. The last couple of years, ray tracing has been, I wouldn't want to say a novelty, but it's not been a prerequisite really to enjoy experiences. I do feel that some games like Control really benefit with hardware-based ray tracing, but I think when consoles are basically going to have it as a baseline, yeah, I think the next generation of AMD and Nvidia GPUs need to really benefit from large improvements over what we see with Turing. Also, I decided just to throw this in here because AMD have reiterated the same thing like 2 trillion times at this point, but they are pinky swearing that the next generation of CPUs, data center GPUs, and of course gaming GPUs will be out by late 2020. And this is obviously official updates, mostly focused on business and how the company have been doing. Well, yeah. I mean, I won't go through all of this because I don't want to turn this into like a lecture of AMD's financials, but revenue of 1.37 billion, which is up 45% year over year, driven by strong Ryzen processor sales. But it's down 5% quarter over quarter because of GPU processor sales, which is honestly not surprising. I think AMD are losing a lot of mind share to Nvidia because of things like hardware-based ray tracing and variable rate shading. But the biggest thing, honestly, I think a lot of folks at this point are just either waiting to see what the next generation of cards bring, or the other alternative is that they are simply holding out and waiting to see what happens with the next generation of consoles. But furthermore, they have begun the initial production of next-generation games consoles for SoCs for the PS5 and Xbox Series X. That is important. That means that the actual SoCs themselves are started to be manufactured. Microsoft have also added EPYC processors to the Office Online applications, which has got over 200 million users, which is, well, quite a few. And furthermore, they've also stated that they're on track for Milan, which of course are the data center CPUs, which also appears to be on track to release by late 2020. Recently, I did put out a video detailing the performance of Zen 3, and it's going to be a pretty tangible upgrade over what we already have. And now for the final thing for today's video, and that is Halo Infinite multiplayer is actually confirmed to be free to play, and also will support up to 120 FPS on the Xbox Series X. I have to say that the free to play aspect of this really interests me. I'm honestly very much expecting the next Xbox event for them to confirm that Xbox Live is going free. Basically, you can just play games online for free. I think for Microsoft in particular, it's always had kind of this weird disconnect that, for the sake of argument, you can play Halo, or let's say Gears 5, and buy the game and play online for free as a PC user, but you can't for Xbox or whatever. And I think that's always kind of a weird thing for Microsoft. It kind of feels like a double standard in a way, but ultimately I think at this point Microsoft just want to get people into the ecosystem, and the best way of doing that is to get them online in multiplayer, and then to get more money through something like Xbox Game Pass, which honestly kind of makes sense, because if they include games like obviously Halo Infinite into the Game Pass, I think it's going to do absolute wonders to get people involved into the Xbox ecosystem. Plus, as well, it brings them a lot of goodwill going into the next generation. As for 120 FPS for the Xbox Series X, I'll be curious to see what the difference is in terms of fidelity, resolution, graphical effects, and so on compared to single-player campaign. I will also be very curious to see how it feels at 120 FPS on a gamepad. I haven't tried the Xbox Series X gamepad yet, so I'm entering it with no expectations and just hoping, you know, that it's awesome experience. PC gaming at 30 FPS to 60 FPS is a huge jump, and I do feel that going from 60 to 120 in some games is it's profound. If you're playing like an online game such as Counter-Strike, having that higher frame rate, it really does make the game feel so much more responsive. So I think it's great that Microsoft are pushing for 120 FPS on the Xbox Series X with select titles online. Obviously, not every game needs that. Say a sports game probably doesn't need 120 FPS. I don't know. I don't really play sports games, but just a guess. But yeah, I'm really interested to see what actually happens with Halo Infinite, especially as Microsoft have recently stated that they want to do a graphical upgrade for the game as well. Anyway, with all of that said, thanks very much for watching the video, the normal stuff. Like, share, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.